If I could get everyone's attention, please. Good afternoon. Please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name is Gillian Riley, President of the Canadian Club of Toronto and your host. Viewers, thank you for joining us. We are proud of our club's record of providing a forum for decision makers and thought leaders to share their ideas with us. Sarada Peri has a lot to say about the power of words. You will hear from her shortly. Before I formally introduce her, let me tell you about some of our upcoming events. On Monday, November 6th, we will host a dynamic panel on the future of corporate governance, moderated by the President and CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors, Rahul Bhardwaj. And on Thursday, November 9th, Harry Finkelstein, the Chief Operating Officer of Shopify, will talk to us about the future of retail. To order tickets or to learn more about the club, please visit our website at canadianclub.org. You can also join the conversation via Twitter and Instagram by following us at CDNCLUBTO or by using that hashtag. I want to acknowledge the youth and young leaders who are with us today from the Ryerson Leadership Lab, sponsored by the Canadian Credit Union Association. Would you please stand so we can acknowledge you? Welcome. We're very delighted that you're with us today. And now our guest speaker. I am very aware of the stress-inducing task of introducing one of the most effective speechwriters of our time. This speech doesn't match up, I'm sure. I promise to keep the introduction short and leave the talking to you, but Sarada Peri, until earlier this year, was special assistant and senior speechwriter to one of the greatest orators to ever hold public office, the 44th President of the United States, President Barack Obama. Sarada has compared her speechwriting role to being like a ghost. It's important to capture how the speaker thinks, not what they sound like. I think we can all agree that Sarada was able to capture the president's thoughts in highly effective ways. Whether it was an international speech, consoling words to victims of violence, or a State of the Union address, the writer and communication strategist has made a career of helping leaders and thinkers deliver persuasive addresses. Before working at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Sarada was principal at West Wing Writers. She helped clients in the corporate, political, and not-for-profit sectors with communications, messaging, and materials. The former high school teacher also worked on Capitol Hill. There, she covered education and health policy issues for former Louisiana Senator Mary Landrieu. She is currently a visiting global fellow at Ryerson University's Leadership Lab. Again, if you have questions as they come up during the speech, please fill out one of the Q&A cards on your table and our staff will collect them. Sarada, the Canadian Club podium is all yours. Welcome.
Well, this is intimidating. So thank you, Gillian, and the Canadian Club for inviting me here today. And I especially want to thank President Mohamed Lashmi and Kareem Bardisi, Shoaib Ahmed, Don Levine, and Neville McGuire at the Ryerson Leadership Lab for hosting me as a visiting global fellow for the past few days. It's been a fun and intense ride, but I'm really grateful to Ryerson and everybody there who's had me. I'm really honored to be here. So I don't know if you've heard, but we've had a bit of a rough go of it back home in the States. So it's been a really breath of fresh air to spend a few days in this really lovely city and frankly get some much needed perspective. Honestly, given the events taking place in my country over the past year, I feel like I need to apologize to you, our friendly northern neighbors, feels like I need to atone for our sins or admit our addiction, our very serious addiction to toxic politics, like a 12-step program. Hello, my name is Sarada. I'm an American. My last tweet was 3 days ago. But take heed, my friends. Be warned. It wasn't all that long ago that we had a leader who was cool and smart and sane. We think of him as the one who got away. Don't let yours get away. It's actually great to be at the Canadian Club. It's sort of a throwback to my days as a White House speechwriter. We drank a lot of Canadian Club. And as Jillian said, I mean, she thinks it's something to have to follow or precede a speechwriter, but can you imagine being the person who writes speeches for Barack Obama and people think you are going to be Barack Obama? I'm definitely not Barack Obama. And so as somebody who tends to write speeches for people who step behind podiums like this, this is pretty unusual for me. So I'm going to do my best to follow my own advice. Be brief, be honest, pay your speechwriter on time, and hopefully we'll have time for a conversation. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and have a conversation. So I was lucky enough to be on an extraordinary team of speechwriters who served President Obama, who we thought of as our speechwriter-in-chief. And I was there during his second term. And so today I want to talk a little bit about what I learned and from how he used words to shape our national narrative. And I'll offer some thoughts for what they're worth about where we find ourselves today, and then I hope we can kind of have a discussion. So the first time I got a firsthand understanding of President Obama's gift for creating our American narrative was a few weeks after I started working at the White House in September of 2014. I was assigned to help President Obama with his remarks to what we call the annual Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Dinner. So in the States, the Congressional Black Caucus is the organization of African-American members of Congress, and they hold an annual dinner that raises money for student scholarships. Every president since its inception has spoken at their annual dinner. So when I got the assignment, I do what speechwriters do. I diligently went back to my desk and read the remarks that previous presidents had given at the event. And they were almost all filled with platitudes about what those administrations had supposedly done on behalf of African Americans, the agendas they'd advanced. But they didn't really sort of seem to say much more than that. They didn't really offer a vision. And of course, I assumed that the first black president, someone who had been a member of the CBC while in the Senate, would have something more profound to say. And he said as much when we met with him to talk about the speech. So after that meeting, I worked on the draft, and I sent it through our rather extensive clearance process. But by the Saturday of the speech was on a Saturday night, President Obama still hadn't looked at it. So I sat waiting, twiddling my thumbs all day in my office for edits, but they just never came. So by the evening, my boss, Cody Keenan, who was the director of speechwriting, told me that the president probably didn't have any edits. So I should just send the final draft to the teleprompter and head to the motorcade to go to the speech. And this is my first time in the motorcade, and it's one of those experiences where nobody tells you what you're supposed to bring. So for some reason, I took my BlackBerry, but I also took my wallet, as though I was going to hail a cab or something. I don't know what I was doing. So I grab a seat in the staff van, and a few minutes later, because the staff gets in the vans first, and then you kind of wait, and as soon as the president comes, you go. So I was sitting there, and the door opens, and a man says to me, "Are you the new speechwriter?" And I say, "Yes." And he says, "Great, here." And he hands me a folder with the president's edits in the motorcade, in the van. And so before I can say a word, the door closes, and we're off to the convention center, which is a 5-minute drive when you can stop traffic, as the president can. And so I try to stay calm. I'm a professional, but I'm freaking out. And the edits actually look scarier than they are when I actually take the time to sort of look at them. Lots of big circles and arrows and moving things around. But so I know I'll have to make them directly into the teleprompter. So we arrive at the convention center, and for this event, the First Lady has actually joined the president, not to make remarks, but just to sort of be there. And so their limo pulls up right to the back entrance, sort of a safety security measure, and then staff gets out on the driveway, and we kind of hurry behind them. And I must have had a look of sort of panic in my eyes, because the president and the First Lady are walking in, and the First Lady gets out of the car, and she's all beautiful and glamorous in her dress, and I'm tiny me, and I'm like, I gotta get to the teleprompter. And so the trip coordinator kind of sees the panic in my eyes and grabs me and sort of races me past the leader of the free world to find the teleprompter. And at this point, I'm a sweaty mess. And so I get there, and the operator lets me quickly make the president's edits. But now I'm not done. No. So the president always had a printed copy of the speech in large font on the podium, as a precaution. And so we had to take that binder, remove the old speech from the binder, and put the new one in. And so we finally finish, and somebody takes the binder to the podium, and now I'm, kind of just standing there waiting. And all this time, the president and the First Lady have actually been working the rope line, greeting VIPs and taking pictures. So I had some time, and they were finished, and now the president was just kind of chatting with staff backstage, hanging out, and I'm a few feet away from him, and I'm minding my own business. Except I'm holding the folder with his edits. I'm holding a copy of that old speech, which was in big font, so there's a lot of pages. I'm holding my BlackBerry, and for some ungodly reason, I'm holding my wallet. And suddenly, I just drop everything, and the papers go flying. So I'm mortified. And I get down on the ground, start gathering things up, and the president just sort of saunters over to me. He's got that swagger, right? He's got a smirk on his face, and he looks at me, and he looks at the papers strewn all over the floor, and he looks back at me, and he says, "Is that my speech?" And I say, Why, yes, sir," as I'm gathering his speech. He says, so what? I'm just going to get up there and open it up and be like, "In conclusion," and now I'm as red as a brown girl can get, right? And he just kind of laughs at me and walks away. Oh no, it gets worse. So then, or maybe better, I'm just standing there stewing in shame, right, having collected the papers, and he comes back and he says, "Come here." And he walks me behind this sort of cordoned off area where the First Lady is standing, and he says, "Michelle, meet my newest speechwriter." And I am mortified and thrilled and kind of totally confused about the moment. And so humiliating myself in front of Barack Obama has become my primary memory from that speech. But there is a point to all of this. When I go back and look at the speech itself, when I can sort of muster the courage to do that, it was actually an example of his ability to take the given moment and place it within the larger context of the American story. So in this case, instead of just once again offering platitudes about all the things that his White House had done for African Americans, he opened up by talking about the history of civil rights in America and how it was sort of up to us to continue the, quote, unfinished work of our nation. He sort of hearkened back to a speech that Lyndon Johnson had given before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And he characterized the challenges facing our country, from income inequality, educational disparities, a criminal justice system that fails too many people of color, as work we must continue to do in the never-ending project of perfecting our union. And he reminded us the true meaning of American exceptionalism in his view. America is special not because we're perfect. America is special because we work to address our problems, to make our union more perfect. It probably wasn't a speech any of you heard, but it was about as Obama as you can get. And it was an example of how a president might use the bully pulpit to do more than just relay the message of the moment. He wasn't always successful in getting the country to agree with him, but he truly never stopped trying. America's 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, was the first to suggest that the White House was a bully pulpit. And what he meant by the word bully was different from what we think of today. He meant awesome in the true sense of the word, or first rate. In his view, the president has an enormously powerful pulpit, allowing him to reach the country and the world with his words. The theory is that presidents who understand this power can show us where they want to take the country and help move people in that direction. It's sort of the field of dreams model of presidential communication. If you build it, they will come. President Obama did this really beautifully, as I'm sure many of you remember, in the 2008 campaign. We all remember his message of hope over fear and unity over discord. And he helped us see that only we, the people, have the power to make the change we seek. And I think this message actually really resonated around the world, not just in America. It was a sentiment that sort of everybody who lived in a society that needed to get better kind of felt. And what was interesting about his message was that people were able to place their own hopes and dreams and sort of their idea of their best selves, or at least the possibility of something better, in the vision he offered. You know, there's always been a debate about whether presidential communication really matters. For my profession, I kind of hope it does. But whether that pulpit is as bully as Teddy made it out to be. And I think the question is even more fraught today when we live in this sort of really fractured media landscape. And it might be naive to think that speeches matter at all. So I'll leave it to historians to determine how President Obama used the bully pulpit. But what I can tell you is that he consistently used the platform of the presidency, and in particular his speeches, to show Americans that our experiences today are part of a larger arc of our nation's story. And as you know, Canada is too, we're a young nation, and so it often feels like everything we're doing is you know, it's new, it's for the first time, but I think he did a really good job of kind of tying our struggles today to where we come from and giving us a sense that because we've come through difficult times before, we can do it again. And in this way, at really important moments, he was able to tie us all together as part of something bigger than ourselves, as divided a country as we often are. And what was interesting, this wasn't just an approach that he reserved for sort of more, I guess, heftier speeches. A powerful lesson for me was watching him infuse that same sense of purpose in all of his remarks. So take cultural events. Whenever the White House hosted musical performances or artistic exhibits, he would always talk about how culture is more than just entertainment, but an integral part of what America is all about. And he used those moments as an opportunity to kind of evoke the cultural ties that bind us, regardless of our differences, and reflect the broader idea of what it means to be American. And I have to say, I was really struck by the recent video of Prime Minister Trudeau mourning the passing of Gord Downie. He clearly was speaking movingly of losing a friend, but he also talked about how much Downie had loved Canada and how he was such a part of the fabric of what makes this country Canada. And I thought about how President Obama we would put out statements recognizing the death of our cultural icons, you know, from Robin Williams to Prince, because like your Prime Minister, I think he really understood how integral culture is to who we are. It's not something that's sort of a sideshow. You know, culture is part of what allows us to be the democracies that we are. And I don't want to suggest that his understanding of the meaning of America was romanticized. On the contrary, I think one of the reasons people gravitated towards him in the first place was that he was willing to sort of tell brave truths. And people want that kind of bold authenticity in their leaders. And so his narrative of America was rooted in his belief in our ability to acknowledge our shortcomings and then move forward together. It's in America, as he often said, where ordinary people have the power to make change. In fact, they are the people who make the change. And interestingly enough, this was a risky thing for him to say, because for every person who appreciated his honesty about maybe parts of our past that we're not so proud of, there was someone who found the notion of admitting our mistakes to be unpatriotic. In fact, there's an entire network dedicated to sort of tearing down this idea that President Obama has. And just as an aside, you know, once in a speech I worked on with him for the National Prayer Breakfast, which is exactly what it sounds like, he dared to suggest that throughout human history, every religion has had its share of violent extremism. And, you know, he suggested, for example, that, you know, Christianity had the Crusades, probably thinking that there wasn't much of a constituency that would vocalize support for the Crusades. We were wrong. This blew up into an unbelievably weird controversy where people called him, you know, drawing false equivalences and how offensive it was. I think one member of Congress, or former member of Congress, actually said it was the most offensive, unpatriotic thing any American had ever said, any American president had ever said. So his approach wasn't always persuasive to everyone, but this commitment to saying what was true, what was, bracingly true, was, I think, why people found President and Mrs. Obama to be authentic communicators and leaders. And in the times when it was most effective, the speech at the 50th anniversary of Selma, for example, which I had nothing to do with. President Obama and Cody worked on that one. He was able to bring us together, if but for a moment. There were a few speeches where right and left could come together and say that he was able to tell the story of America in a way that we all fit inside of it. And so the next obvious question is, well, what about Trump? Isn't he authentic? His supporters would certainly call him brave. People think he tells it like it is. He does come across as authentic. But in my view, saying whatever nonsense comes out of your head and berating your fellow Americans with a pastiche of racist, sexist, and all manner of offensive tropes is in no way brave. And it's far from truthful. He's not telling it like it is. But what he is doing really strategically is giving voice to people's most deeply held prejudices instead of challenging them. And the people who already agree with him find that to be authentic and refreshing. But if leadership is in part the ability to set a vision and then bring people along to achieve a shared goal, then he's always going to fall short. You can't lead a country if you're alienating the majority of it. You can win elections, but that's probably about it. So here's the difference. Obama, I think, managed to be authentic and honest and forthcoming about sometimes very difficult subjects, but not simply for the shock value, not to amp people up or stoke fears. He did it because he thought that you needed the starting point of honesty, with the goal of persuading people to believe in his vision for America, one where we don't always get it right the first time, but we keep trying. And Trump is doing the opposite. He's shooting from the hip with the goal of speaking only to the people who already support him and with no seeming interest in persuading anyone else. And the only way to govern in that circumstance is, I think, by fiat. Our best presidents could create moments of unity through the bully pulpit. Our current president just uses the pulpit to bully. And here's the thing, though, he didn't get there alone. And I think everyone around the world should sort of be warned about this. This isn't, I don't think, just an American phenomenon. He had a lot of help, and I'm not just talking about Russia, although that certainly helped. It was a media that gave free airtime to his unfiltered id and drew false equivalences between Hillary Clinton's mistakes and Trump's outright scandals. It was the social media outlets that did allow Russian hackers, as we're learning, to plant misleading and mendacious stories to targeted audiences, deliberately stoking their fears and feeding their misconceptions. It was the deep and damaging misogyny that helped sink Hillary Clinton's candidacy and rewarded a self-proclaimed sexual assaulter with the Oval Office. So these things had an even greater effect because they preyed on our already weakened institutions, which is something we've been talking about this week with the Ryerson Leadership Lab. They exploited the fact that many in our country are increasingly cynical and no longer have faith in our political process. And what happens is the institutions weaken and somebody fills that vacuum, and then we get even more cynical. So getting out of this is I think, on us, and I'm not going to pretend to have any answers, but I think it takes an informed and educated citizenry to sort of push back against these forces. And again, that's extremely difficult when, at least in America, we have an entire cable news network committed to spreading disinformation. But we do have to somehow fight back. And one thing I think that hasn't changed, even with sort of this notion that somehow Trump has changed communication and changed presidential communication, is that a democracy is still best run on the fuel of hope and not fear. And you can actually start to see it in our polling, which is getting increasingly interesting. Everything changes every day, and you can't keep track of it on Twitter. But the trends are interesting. So Trump remains popular among Republicans, but his national approval rate has plummeted to sort of absurdly low levels historically. He's down to, I think, 38%. And perhaps more interestingly, even Republicans don't like his rhetoric on certain issues, say North Korea. And a Fox News poll taken at the end of August found that 56% of respondents thought he was tearing the country apart, while only 33% said that he was bringing it together. That's Fox News. So I can't predict what any of this means. I think there are forces at work here that are far bigger than the powers of presidential persuasion. But I also, we were really sort of brokenhearted after the election, but I've since then kind of kept reminding myself that I think President Obama was right when he said often that cynicism is a choice and hope is a better choice. And I also have to believe him. The day after the election, I stood on the colonnade that surrounds the White House, Rose Garden, and it was sort of a really sad scene of White House staffers. Later on, my mother texted me and said, "I saw you on MSNBC. You looked so sad." So we were all standing on the colonnade that surrounds the White House Rose Garden, which was a garden first installed by Teddy Roosevelt's wife more than a century ago. And speaking to the country, Obama said, "We zig and zag, and sometimes we move in ways that some people think is forward and others think is moving back." And, the hard work of progress, all it entails is not up to one person or even one generation. It's just impossible. It can't be. I think our presidents can offer us their vision for America. They can try to persuade us that their path is the right one. But whether we choose to follow them is entirely up to us. So with that, I'm hoping we can kind of open it up for questions and have a conversation.
So you want to stay?
Okay.
You stay at the podium. I have a few questions that have been given to me. If you come up with some as we're up here, please jot them down, and we can still collect them. So here's the first one. This is a nice question. Could you take us through the composition of the Amazing Grace speech? How was it conceived, developed?
Okay, so this is a eulogy that the president gave in Charleston, South Carolina, after a white supremacist murdered 9 black churchgoers, including the pastor of the church. I had nothing to do with this speech. Cody and my boss Cody and President Obama wrote it together. And actually, Cody has spoken much more eloquently since he was in the room about that speech. But what I can tell you is that it's again one of those speeches where, President Obama has been thinking about these issues for his entire life. And it matters when you have somebody who has sort of a rich interior and can offer his thoughts on that moment in a way that's really credible. The one thing I do know is that he said on the plane over to Cody, because the Amazing Grace, the passage was in the speech, they had decided to use that, and he said to Cody, "There's a 50-50 chance I'll sing it." So that much I know.
Did he sing it?
He did.
I get goosebumps just thinking about that.
This is a really good one.
Okay. I can't read it, so.
I think I got it.
Did you read that? Veep?
West.
Oh, West Wing. Okay, thank you. Veep, West Wing. I don't know the first one. Sorry, I don't watch TV. I do know House of Cards. Which one is most like the real White House?
I think our White House was probably a combination of Veep and the West Wing, except speechwriters weren't negotiating trade agreements. But I feel like the current White House might be House of Cards.
Sorry, I have to ask, what is Veep?
Oh, Veep is a hilarious satire of
TV show on the
Yes,
White House?
yes.
Okay. How will the Democrats rise above the bluster of the Twitter president to get their message through?
You got me. I think the Twitter president, as the question was praised, he reacts to the news and he makes news. I'm not so sure he drives the news anymore. And I think you actually saw that this weekend when the news was bubbling that Bob Mueller, the special counsel who's been tasked to investigate the Russia's collusion, possible collusion, when there was noise that there might be an indictment, I mean, I purposely don't follow Trump on Twitter, but you can't miss it. He was just kind of going nuts, reacting, and but what about Hillary? But what about Hillary? It doesn't mean anything. I mean, it was like the guiltiest kid ever, right? And so his especially lately, he's gotten so reactive and so defensive, and so there's that piece of it. Second piece of it too, I would say, is I think the Republicans are going to have a really hard time messaging the thing that they're trying to draw attention to, which is their tax reform plan, which is basically just a massive tax cut for the wealthy. I really don't know how you message that. So in that sense, I think that if Democrats kind of stay focused on what's actually going on in people's lives and how these policies will actually affect them, we're going to probably do better. It turns out that Trump voters are probably never going to switch over, and many Americans, I guess, aren't paying as much attention to these sort of investigations. And these are a slow burn. These investigations are going to go on for a while. But what they are going to hold everybody who they elected accountable for is to fulfill the promises they made. And Trump made a whole lot of promises, mostly to the working class. And so if these policies actually go anywhere, if Congress can get itself together to pass anything, that thing is going to be a tax bill that's a boondoggle for the rich. And so I think Democrats should, one thing we should do is really hammer that home.
Okay, here's a more personal question.
Sure.
What spurred your career change from high school teacher to speechwriter?
Yeah, and there was a career in the middle there too. So I graduated from college. I went to Tufts University outside of Boston, and I did Teach for America, which is a program that places recent college graduates into under-resourced school districts across the country. So I was placed in New Orleans, and I taught high school English there for a couple of years, and was so frustrated by sort of the systemic injustice I saw that led my students to be in a situation where they were getting a subpar education that I wanted to work in education policy. So I moved to Washington, and I worked for a nonprofit that worked with our state legislators, I guess the equivalent of your provincial governments, on progressive legislation. And then I went to the Kennedy School of Government and got my master's in public policy. And there I'd always loved writing, and I was writing more at the Kennedy School, but I didn't really know how that could be a job. And candidly, the only speechwriting wasn't even on my radar screen. And so I was lucky enough to get a job on Capitol Hill working for a senator from Louisiana, the state where I had taught, working on education and healthcare issues. But the whole time I was there, I kind of just still felt the pull towards writing. And I was complaining to a friend at a party about my job one day, as one does. And she said, I know a guy who's a speechwriter. You should just talk to him. And I thought, speechwriting a job? My only understanding of it was the guys on the West Wing, and I didn't think that was a job. But I talked to him, and he was a partner at this firm called West Wing Writers, and after a writing test, they hired me in 2010, and I was there for about 4.5 years, and then the White House called. So.
Okay, here's a nice one. What is your vision for the American story?
This sounds like a cop-out, but I think I really do share President Obama's view of it. I'm kind of a American presidential history buff, and have thought a lot about kind of the arc of our story, and I actually think he kind of has it right. This notion that to be patriotic, you must stand and salute the flag and agree that everything that we've ever done is the right thing, that we must defend the indefensible, as currently the president's chief of staff is doing by defending the Confederacy, which was literally a traitorous movement to break up America. I think that's actually just a really dangerous path towards authoritarianism. I do think that the idea of America is, we are a nation of immigrants that was born out of an original sin of slavery, not to mention the annihilation of some Native Americans, and that the goal of the America that we built is one to just keep getting better. We are never going to be perfect, but we can keep trying to perfect it, and that means admitting where we've fallen short and continuing to sort of make the ideal of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness available for everybody, no matter who they are. I really believe that President Obama had it right, but I think it happens in fits and starts, our progress towards that, and right now we're just sort of in a frustrating moment.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question,
Sure.
I just thought of while you were standing there. Do you think you would ever run for politics?
No, no, that's a bad idea. So I'm not as unhinged as Trump, but I'm pretty unfiltered, and no, I think I'm much better as a staffer.
This is the final question for real. What speech that you worked on are you the proudest of and why? It's a nice final question.
That is a nice final question. I feel like I give a different answer to this every time it's asked. It's a question I get a lot. One of the speeches actually that I really loved, and I told this story this morning, but I'll tell it again because I feel like there are a lot of women in the audience. So last summer, the White House held something called the United State of Women Summit, which was sort of the first summit the White House held focused on kind of the progress the administration had made on behalf of women and girls and sort of what work was to be done. It was kind of a celebration, culmination, and I really doubt this White House will hold such a summit. And so President Obama had to give the keynote, and we were thinking about what to talk about. And again, often in these speeches, you sort of shout out to the interest group and just, give platitudes about women's empowerment and, the education for girls and, we ought to be doing these things. But then they never actually happen. and women still remain profoundly unequal in our misogynistic society. And so, he thought, let's actually go at the sort of the core reasons, the stereotypes and double standards that prevent women from achieving equality in society. And he really wanted to sort of take this out of the idea that these are just women's issues and women's problems and sort of talk about how they affect all of us, how sexism and inequality actually is bad for men too. And so he wanted to offer this really full-throated assertion of his feminism, which in and of itself was good enough for me. I mean, I was so proud that he wanted to do that. And then that's what we did. He just went and kind of went at stereotypes in a really raw, honest way, pushing back against, the idea that we, teach our boys to, be assertive and our girls to be nice, and we never let our boys shed a tear, and, we sort of demonize women for their sexuality and give men a pat on the back for theirs. I mean, he really went for it. And I'd never heard, any leader, let alone the President of the United States, saying these things and sort of being really open and bold in stating his feminism. And I think that was so important, not just for the women in the room and the women who were listening, but for men and for boys, to look up to a president who treats women equally and who really believes in it, in his core. So I think it was really a gift to work on that one.
Excellent. So, Sarada, on behalf of the Canadian Club of Toronto, I would like to thank you. Certainly your passion, your commitment to what you do, your thought-provoking topics today, and I also enjoyed your sense of humor. So, it was just an outstanding delivery for someone who's a speechwriter, too. We appreciated your perspectives on the fragmented and crowded media landscape that we consume daily and that leaders engage with for maximum impact. As you pointed out, today's communications platforms have transformed the way we share our thoughts and ideas. Whether we tweet, post, share, or like, the power of our thoughts is unmistakable. What we appreciated hearing from you, Sarada, is how we can also harness the way we communicate for good, which I think you did a lot of today. To unite, to provide hope, to advocate for positive change. You have obviously done this brilliantly throughout your career. Please accept our good wishes for success in all your future endeavors. We'd also like to thank MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. To learn more about the club, please visit us at canadianclub.org. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you'll return again soon. À la prochaine. Thank you. You did a nice job.